1931, Geli Raubal, the niece of Adolf Hitler, was found dead at his apartment in Munich. Although officially ruled a suicide, many people believe the truth about her death has been covered up. But by whom? And what were they trying to hide?
They were quite close. Probably, by the looks of it, they were a bit too close.
There was something quite pathological with how obsessed he was with everything that she did.
It was, at the very least, possessive, cruel, exploitative, manipulative, that he'd actually gone right into the boundaries of outright sexual abuse.
Wilhelm Hermann Göring.
I think it's a very fertile ground, conspiracy theorists. The cloud of electric flex wire around.
No home in the world untouched.
Yes, he had not committed suicide, but that he had been murdered.
Defendants make final statements to the tribunal.
Ich selbst möchte aber hier ganz aus der Tiefe meines...
Munich, today the capital of Bavaria, and the third largest city in Germany. A home to renowned universities and cultural institutions. But in 1931, it was home to the Nazi Party headquarters and the private residence of Adolf Hitler. It was that same year that Geli Raubal, Hitler's niece, was found dead in his apartment, aged just 23, from an apparent suicide. But the events leading up to her death and the secrecy surrounding the investigation into it have caused many to question the official verdict, with suggestions of incest, murder, and a cover-up within the Nazi Party just months before seizing power.
There was a close relationship. The precise nature of that relationship is still very much unclear.
1925 was a formative year for Adolf Hitler. Recently released from Landsberg prison for his part in the Beer Hall Putsch, he announced the re-establishment of the Nazi Party and proclaimed himself its leader. In that same year, he formed the SS, released his book Mein Kampf, and bought an apartment near the party headquarters in Munich.
A scene of a crime. Dort ist zwischen dem 17. und 18. September 1931 die Hitlernichte Geli Raubal ums Leben gekommen. Die offizielle Lesart ist, es war Selbstmord, aber die Indizien dafür, dass es Mord war, sind meines Erachtens ähnlich oder genauso stark, wie dass es Selbstmord war.
In the mid-1920s, Hitler asked his half-sister Angela to come and be his housekeeper when he bought his first ever property, which was the house Wachenfeld, which later became the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. She came there with her two daughters, Geli and Elfriede.
Of the two girls, Hitler took a particular shine to his eldest niece, Geli Raubal.
Geli was young, vivacious. She was someone who had a ready smile.
Geli was a thoroughly normal young woman. She was cheerful, she was bubbly, not hugely intelligent, I would say, but certainly life-affirming and fun.
One of Hitler's confidants, his photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, said that Geli could light up a room. She could change the mood in a room. So she was certainly someone who was a very lively individual, who was very popular. So very different, really, from the person we imagine Hitler to be.
Hitler was a sort of dour kind of person. He was very much a kind of a depressive type of person. You know, you had to cheer Hitler up, and she did that.
He was delighted with Geli. He found her refreshing, cheerful, With her, he could sort of forget the cares of a professional politician and just enjoy her company. That was how it sort of innocently all began.
Over time, Geli started to develop into a headstrong and ambitious young woman. She was described as whimsical, funny, and mischievous. A stark contrast to her uncle Adolf.
Hitler was an old-fashioned, rather bourgeois individual in his behaviour, generally, but specifically towards women. He used to kiss ladies' hands, was very polite. At the same time, he didn't think that women had much to contribute beyond looking pretty and producing children.
Despite his misogynist views, from a young age, some of Hitler's most intense personal relationships had been with the women in his life.
Hitler's attitude to women was weird. He certainly had an over-close relationship with his own mother, which veered between him dominating her and then being sentimentally attached to her. In fact, the doctor who treated Hitler's mother in her last illness said he had never seen a closer attachment in all his years of practice as that between Hitler and his mother, Clara.
Hitler's mother had doted on him as a boy. But after being diagnosed with cancer when he was just a teenager, Hitler took up caring for her. Completely devoted to her until the end, it was said that he never recovered from the loss of his mother.
He didn't have a proper girlfriend until he's nearly 37. So that's rather strange, isn't it? For a heterosexual man to go that long without having a girlfriend. If he was highly sexed, why don't we see in Vienna some girlfriends? Why don't we see in the early Nazi period some girlfriends? We don't see any.
He had a puritanical disgust in his youthful years in Vienna with the sexual life that was going on around him. He did visit the red light district in Vienna, but not as a customer. He went there to express disgust at what was going on there.
Hitler had always liked to cultivate the image of a man married only to his country, with no time for romantic pursuits. He felt, therefore, that his young niece, Geli, would be the perfect option to provide him with day-to-day companionship. It was the beginnings of a relationship that would ultimately end in tragedy.
He would take her to, dinners, he would take her to restaurants, he would take her to parties. And so people sort of thought, who is she? Is that his girlfriend?
From about 1927, they were relatively close, so they saw each other often. Hitler used to take her to accompany him to events, to not necessarily political events, but it could be musical events. So he used to often have Geli on his arm.
It developed into quite a close relationship between the two of them. She was quite attractive. He didn't have any girlfriends, so she became his kind of consort.
But before long, the relationship stopped being one of convenience and instead turned into something far more intense. Many believe now, as they did then, that Hitler was no longer looking at Geli as just his niece.
There was a close relationship. The precise nature of that relationship is still very much unclear.
They were so close. I mean, you can see this in some of the photographs of them. There's a kind of coquettishness about Geli that Hitler liked, and you see them looking comfortable together. There's definitely a chemistry there between them.
Hitler's feelings towards Geli changed very much as the older she got. I think she was 17 when they first got together.
From 1929, certainly when she moved in with him, he seems to have developed this rather obsessive guardianship over her, a sense of wanting to control every aspect of her life.
Hitler was becoming very attached to her. I think Hitler loved her, you know, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think he may have been physically attracted to her as well. Whether she was physically attracted to Hitler is doubtful.
Hitler certainly does appear to have taken his role as guardian very, very seriously, even to the point of an obsession, that he was very controlling over her life, wanted to prevent her from having any relationships outside.
By the time Geli reached her late teens, she had started to become tired of being her uncle's accessory.
By the time she was about 19, she wanted to study, and she wanted to wear makeup and go to dances and do all the things that a normal teenage young woman would want to do. And of course, he found this unacceptable. She was his pet, his plaything, if you like, even if no playing took place. And he resented deeply her desire for independence.
She felt it was a little bit oppressive, really. So she wanted freedom, and Hitler, of course, he was history's greatest control freak.
Geli, who was very lively, very flighty individual, it was very normal, I suppose, for her to want to have relationships, and relationships beyond the relationship she had, platonic or otherwise, with her uncle. But Hitler liked to try and control every aspect of her life.
As she got older, she wanted to have, you know, relationships with men other than Hitler. And she started to have a secret relationship with Hitler's chauffeur, Emil Maurice.
Geli was said to have fallen deeply in love with a member of Hitler's close inner circle. Emil Maurice was Hitler's chauffeur and part of his personal protection detail. According to Maurice, he and Geli had planned to marry. But when Hitler found out, he demanded they put an end to their relationship.
He particularly got enraged at the idea that she was having an erotic sexual relationship with one of his close aides. He actually found them together in a compromising situation and had a riding whip in his hand, which he habitually carried at that time, and threatened to horsewhip, literally, Maurice, and Maurice had to jump out of the window to escape. And in fact, from that time on, he lost his position at Hitler's side and lost his leading position in Hitler's circle. So there's no doubt that Hitler's feelings for Geli went from uncly, normal affection into an all-consuming, semi-erotic passion.
There was something quite pathological with how obsessed he was with everything that she did. You know, absolutely showing interest and caring is one thing, but being competitive with potential suitors, that's not what one would expect to see in a normal uncle-niece relationship.
The nature of their relationship had become so unstable that it wasn't just Hitler who was displaying domineering behavior. Strangely, Geli too had started to show signs of jealousy.
All the people around them thought there was some kind of frisson between them. If she started to talk to, say, younger men, he wouldn't like it. And if he started to talk to women, she wouldn't like it. They were quite close. Probably, by the looks of it, they were a bit too close.
This is supposed to be a platonic relationship, but this seemed to border on almost a pseudo-sexual relationship, or at least something that implied something more intimate. That's why when you read this case, it's very unsettling.
Desperate to live life on her own terms, she started to push back against his rules and demands, often resulting in explosive arguments.
She had probably quite a strong will, which resulted in dramatic verbal clashes between her and Hitler. The more she wanted to forge her own path, go out, escape his total and all-consuming control. And the more she did that, the more hysterical he got and the more determined to thwart that desire.
The peculiar nature of their relationship did not go unnoticed by those around them, and people had started to talk. But they would realize in the years to come that their loose tongues would cost them their freedom and even their lives.
eyewitnesses and people in Hitler's entourage realized that the relationship was becoming quite fraught. They were having arguments. Some neighbors said they could hear them shouting in the apartment through the walls. There are some people who were around the scene at the time. You know, Albert Speer was one of them. Hoffman, who was his photographer, mentions this in his memoirs about these blazing rows that they had. So people saw this.
By now, rumors had also started to circulate that Hitler's relationship with Geli was far darker than had previously been thought.
There were rumors that Geli had told friends, people she met, that Hitler had gone far beyond the bounds of unclear affection, that he had made pornographic drawings of her in the nude, and that he'd actually gone right into the boundaries of outright sexual abuse of the woman.
One of the people who reported that Geli had confided in them was Otto Strasser. Strasser was a member of the Nazi Party and political rival of Adolf Hitler. He maintained that Geli had told him that Hitler demanded things of her that were, in her words, simply disgusting, adding that she never dreamed that such things could happen.
We'll never know whether that's true or not. But Hitler's political opponents certainly suggested that this was the case. And the relationship was so public that it couldn't really be kept secret, and people certainly raised eyebrows about it.
With the Nazi Party on the verge of seizing power, they could ill afford any public scandals, especially relating to the leader of the party being romantically involved with his young niece.
They saw it as a possible cause of embarrassment and blackmail. Hitler's opponents, political opponents, would use it to blackmail or to suggest that the Führer was involved in a perverse relationship with his own niece.
To the party, image was everything, and they would go to great lengths to protect themselves from any bad publicity.
There is some suggestion that the Nazis themselves deliberately destroyed what evidence there was. For example, it's said that pornographic drawings made by Hitler were around and were hawked around for people wanting to sell them or blackmail him, and that these were found and destroyed by the Nazis.
Catholic priest Father Bernhard Stempfel was both a friend and advisor to Adolf Hitler. It was alleged that Stempfel was involved in the retrieval of a letter said to be written by Hitler to Geli, the contents of which would have caused major embarrassment if it had been leaked.
Es ist auch so, dass die Münchner Post und andere Zeitungen auf diesen Dingen öffentlich rumgeritten haben. Die Nazis waren also als Sexskandal trächtig in den Medien bereits präsent.
Hitler and Geli's relationship had become a real cause of concern for the senior Nazi Party officials. But their worries would be short-lived.
In September 1931, this relationship comes to a head. There is an ongoing discussion, stroke argument, which is that Geli wants to go and live her life. She's 23 by this point. She wants to go and live her life. She wants to become a singer.
There seemed to be this sort of argument going on about could she have these vocal lessons in Vienna, and would Uncle Dolph, as she called him, pay for them?
We do know that in general terms that it was again about her wish to be independent. She wanted to go to Vienna and to study. She wanted more freedom to go out.
He started shouting, and some neighbours heard this row, and it was along the lines of something like, "You're not going to Vienna, and that's the end of it."
The next day, members of Hitler's house staff made a tragic discovery.
She was found dead on the floor of her room with a bullet through her heart from Hitler's own personal pistol.
Detectives from the Munich Police Department were called to examine the scene and interview any potential witnesses who could shed light on what had happened. Gerhard Firmetz, a German historian and researcher from Augsburg University, has come to the Bavarian State Archives in Munich to review Geli Raubal's official police file.
This one is a file on homicides in Bavaria during the period 1929 to 1937. And we find a report on the Raubal case of September 28, 1931. It describes what the police found on the spot. They found Angela Raubal lying on the floor. It also says all the people who were in the flat at the time of the arrival of the police. There were 5 people in the flat, but only 4 were asked about what they had actually seen. The 5th person, Franz Schwarz, member of the Munich City Council, was not asked about his observations. He is not asked, and his name doesn't appear a second time. Just the statement in the beginning that he was in the flat when the police arrived.
Franz Schwarz was in fact also treasurer of the Nazi Party and a close friend of Adolf Hitler. Despite being one of the first people to arrive at the scene of Geli's death, Schwarz was never questioned by the police. The detectives had also found several inconsistencies in the accounts given by the house staff. There were different versions given regarding who found her body and who entered the room first. But they all agreed on one specific thing. Hitler was nowhere near the apartment when it happened. From the evidence and statements gathered by the police, it was surmised that when Hitler had left the apartment after their argument, Geli had become increasingly distraught. Knowing where her uncle kept his gun, she went to his cabinet and retrieved the Walther .635 caliber pistol from his drawer. She then made her way to her bedroom, locking the door behind her to avoid any interruptions from the house staff. The police believe that Geli then loaded the gun. But instead of putting the barrel to her head, she made the decision to turn the gun around and hold it against her chest.
She apparently missed her heart with the shot and she punctured her own lung. She died of loss of blood and effectively drowning in her own blood. So she would have died later that same day.
Strangely, other than a cursory look at the body by the police doctor, no autopsy was performed, and the death was ruled as suicide. But even at the time, the speed in which the investigation was wrapped up caused many to become suspicious. One of the first things about her death that people noted was the unusual way in which Geli was supposed to have shot herself.
Und laut dieser Selbstmordtheorie hätte sie sich ins Herz schießen wollen, die Waffe aufgesetzt Und zwar so, also oberhalb des Herzens, sehr unwahrscheinlich, dass jemand so versucht, Selbstmord zu begehen. Sie verfehlte auch das Herz und hatte dann einen Lungenschuss. Und daran ist sie sehr qualvoll gestorben.
The newspapers of the time had also picked up on the story, and Geli's death became national news.
Straight away, there are rumours in Germany which are suggesting that there's some sort of unnatural, nefarious side to this relationship, that it was incestuous, that the two were having an affair, that Geli might have been pregnant with Hitler's child.
Dr. Fritz Gerlich was a Munich-based journalist and newspaper editor who had been investigating the story of Geli's death. He wrote extensively on the subject and made his opinion very clear, that Geli had not committed suicide.
By extension, Geli had been done away with, had been murdered. She was a witness too many and had been done away with by one of Hitler's acolytes.
The rumors that Geli's death had been the result of a murder continued. It was even suggested that she was murdered on the orders of high-ranking members of the Nazi Party.
Als sehr unsicher galt, weil sie über dieses Privatleben auch mit mehreren Leuten gesprochen hat. Image fürchteten, und wenn diese Dinge über Hitlers Privatleben herausgekommen wären, beziehungsweise breitgetreten wurden, dann hätten sie das als schwere Belastung empfunden.
In 1931, the Nazis are very much the up-and-coming power in German politics. So on the back of the economic crash, Wall Street crash of 1929, and then by extension, the German economic crisis of 1930, the Nazis are reaping the political rewards of that economic crisis. So they're very much the up-and-coming power.
Wenn diese Dinge an die Öffentlichkeit geraten, Sexualpraktiken, ist das schlecht für die Partei. Wie man sich über Hitler und die Partei lustig gemacht hätte. Also sie muss sterben.
The theory that Geli had in fact been murdered seemed to be plausible to many people. But the suspicion didn't just fall on the Nazi Party itself. Rumors had also started to spread in the newspapers and on the streets that one person in particular was directly responsible for her death.
There were some speculations at that time already that it has not been a suicide, but could also have been a homicide by an unknown person, and the name of Hitler was in the discussion already, because he was the owner of the flat.
But according to Hitler, he was nowhere near Geli at the time of her death, having already left for a meeting in Nuremberg.
Es gibt aber zwei Aussagen, zwei offizielle durch den Mediziner gemachte, durch den Polizeibericht.
One statement said that Geli had been dead for 8 hours, placing Hitler in Nuremberg at the time of her death. But in another contradictory statement in the same report, the police also revealed that she had been dead for approximately 24 hours.
Wäre sie 24 Stunden schon tot, das hieße, Hitler hätte sie leicht umbringen können, hätte kein Alibi.
During his official police interview, Hitler also went on to deny having constant disagreements with his niece, adding that on the night in question, no argument had broken out between the two at any time.
People in the house who heard it, people who were waiting to escort Hitler on the speaking tour, later testified that they had a blazing row as Hitler was leaving, shouting at each other, and off he went.
Hitler left to go in his limousine to the station to go and give a speech that evening, which he did. which of course gives him an alibi.
But journalist Fritz Gerlich continued with his investigation, publishing an article in which it was alleged that witnesses who had viewed Geli's body claimed that she had suffered injuries other than the gunshot wound to her chest.
There was an article in Munich newspaper stating that probably Geli Raubal had not committed suicide.
Dann kommt hinzu, dass verschiedene Zeugen, zum Beispiel die Frauen, die den Leichnam gewaschen haben, gesehen haben, dass sie blaue Flecke hatte. Und dann gibt es auch Zeugen, die sagten, sie hätte eine gebrochene Nase und blaue Flecken im Gesicht. Und
Backing up Hitler's claim that no violent quarrel with Geli took place, Dr. Muller of the Munich Police Department issued a press release. Muller claimed to have re-examined her body and that the marks discovered on Geli were consistent with the fact that her body had been found lying face down.
She was lying in this position for about 17, 18 hours, and that explained why her nose was broken. This has not been a result of hitting in the face, for instance, but of her falling down. So this second examination by Dr. Müller stated again that must have been suicide. At least he did not find any hint on a shooting by third person.
sagt der offizielle Bericht, das ist passiert, als sie hingefallen ist, dass sie sich da die Nase gebrochen hat. Man könnte aber auch vermuten, dass das die blauen Flecke und die gebrochene Nase von einem Kampf oder von körperlicher Gewalt her rühren.
Shortly after the release of the police statement, Franz Gürtner, the Bavarian justice minister, agreed for Geli's body to be released and sent for burial in Vienna, outside of German jurisdiction. It was noted, however, that Geli's death seemed to have had a profound effect on Adolf Hitler.
When the body was discovered, Hitler was informed and was horrified. Supposedly he went white and was speechless for some time afterwards. So it's clear that Hitler was very closely, personally affected. According to members of his inner circle, he contemplated suicide. Hitler was, by all accounts, was absolutely grief-stricken in the aftermath, genuinely grief-stricken.
Geli's death certainly affected him, albeit briefly, but deeply affected him as a politician. He was nearing the threshold of power, and he took himself off, went into his private quarters, brooded on it. He came close, I think, to breaking down entirely.
It's interesting that he had a bust made of Geli by a very prominent German sculptor by the name of Ferdinand Liebermann. And it was made in bronze, and it was put up in her bedroom in the flat in Munich. And the bedroom, as did a room in the Berghof, both buildings had effectively a shrine to Geli Raubal, both of them with fresh flowers, with photographs, and in the case of the Munich flat, with a bust as well.
But some have questioned whether his behavior was a result of grief or guilt.
I don't think there's any way to kind of discriminate between the two. I think clearly he was in a lot of pain. Now, what caused that pain, I think, is anyone's guess.
Hitler was a supreme egotist, so it wouldn't really have stopped him doing what he considered his chosen path to political power. But it certainly, more than any other event, I think, in his emotional life, hit him hard. It was seen as a weakness of his, and that if he didn't recover himself pretty smartly, that it would be a threat.
It didn't take long for Hitler to get back on the campaign trail. He was soon touring the country, giving speeches and gaining followers.
He soon recovered, and within a fortnight, he was beginning talks and manoeuvring and negotiating on the path to power that eventually put him into the Chancellery.
The events of 1931, which potentially could have derailed the whole Nazi rise to power, did force the Nazis into the process of cleaning up their act, being much more conscious of public image, particularly of Hitler. To that extent, I think the Geli Raubal case, almost accidentally, does cause that process of cleaning up Hitler's public image, which, in its way, helped his rise to power.
In 1933, the Nazi Party were voted into power, and Adolf Hitler became Germany's new Chancellor. But Hitler still had opposition from within the country.
The decision was made so that the sort of potential embarrassment that he had in 1931 over the suicide of Geli Raubal could not happen again.
So in 1934, to cement his hold on the nation, Hitler decided to purge the country of what he considered to be enemies of the state.
Eine gute Möglichkeit, mit alten Freunden abzurechnen, die zu viel wussten, auch zu viel über den Fall Geli Raubal und die Beziehung zu Hitler, wurden dann 1934 in der Nacht der langen Messer.
The Night of the Long Knives was Hitler's attempt to rid the country of individuals who were considered a danger to the Nazi regime. And between the 30th of June and the 2nd of July 1934, an estimated 85 people were executed. But it was soon noticed that among those killed or forced to flee were people directly connected to the Geli Raubal case.
Einige Historiker haben erkannt, dass Leute, die Hitler sehr lange und sehr früh kannten, dass die eigentlich eine kurze Lebenszeit hatten. Offiziell die SA einen Putsch versuchte und Hitler den durch die SS niederschlagen ließ. Da sind dann wundersamerweise auch Leute umgebracht worden, die überhaupt nichts mit der SA oder mit dem Putsch.
Bernhard Stempfel, the one-time close friend of Hitler, who had supposedly helped retrieve letters written to Geli, was found dead in a remote forest in Munich. While Fritz Gerlich, the journalist who had been investigating Geli's death, was executed at the Dachau concentration camp. And Otto Strasser, who had claimed that Geli had divulged details to him about her relationship with Hitler, had to flee into exile to escape the same fate. But there were some people, also associated with the Geli Raubal case, who fared much better. Franz Gertner, who had presided over the case as the Bavarian Justice Minister, was promoted by Hitler to Justice Minister of the whole of the Reich.
Also die Polizei und die Justiz in München war durchaus nazifreundlich damals. Das hing auch damit zusammen, dass der Justizminister ja ein alter Freund von Hitler.
Franz Schwarz, the Nazi Party member who failed to be interviewed by police at the scene of Geli's death, went on to be given the position of SS Obergruppenführer and remained a close member of Hitler's inner circle.
Also insofern sehe ich das schon als ein Cover-up, ausgehend auch vielleicht von einigen Leuten in der Polizei schon. Denn damals haben sie in der Münchner Polizei schon so zwielichtige Gestalten herumgetrieben wie der spätere Gestapo-Müller. Ja, das war eine bewusste, freundliche Behandlung des Falles nach der Theorie, die die Nazis offiziell verbreitet haben wollten.
The true nature of Hitler's relationship with Geli will probably never be known. But the circumstances surrounding her death will continue to divide opinion for generations to come.
There were enough enemies of Hitler that, had it been murder, would have made that stick. And although it was obviously the subject of lots of scandal and gossip, I think if there had been hard evidence that Geli had been murdered, his enemies would have trumpeted it from the rooftops instead of just whispered it.
Geli Raubal's death is investigated as thoroughly as any other death would have been. And there was no suggestion from that investigation that it was anything other than a suicide.
In the conspiracy theory, Hitler shot her, then he left the house, but there's no evidence for that. There's no evidence that he shot her whatsoever. In all likelihood, she was left in the apartment on her own. She went to her bedroom, she locked the door, and then she shot herself. It looks like this is case closed. You know, Geli Raubal killed herself.
But after Hitler's own suicide and Germany's defeat in World War II, investigations into crimes that took place under Nazi rule were re-examined by Germany's new police force.
In 1949, the Munich police tried to reconstruct the killing of Dr. Fritz Gerlich, a well-known journalist who was confronting the Nazis in the 1920s and 30s with his newspaper. The police tried to reconstruct who actually had ordered to kill him and who executed him. In the final report of this examination, there is the speculation that Dr. Gerlich had collected material on the alleged suicide of Hitler's niece, Angela Raubal. The police officer in 1949 suggests that Dr. Gerlich might have known more about the Raubal case, and that one of the reasons why he was executed in 1934 was to keep him quiet.
While the argument between those who believe she was murdered and those who believe she committed suicide continues, both sides seem to agree on one thing, that regardless of how Geli died, one person alone is ultimately responsible for her death.
His relationship with his niece, Geli, was unhealthy, shall we say, even if we don't believe the most lurid tales about it. It was, at the very least, possessive, cruel, exploitative, manipulative.
It would have sort of been a perfect storm if you wanted to set up a situation where someone became sort of desperate and despondent.
That combination produced a very toxic atmosphere, and that ultimately produces her suicide. That results in her suicide. So he bears a degree of responsibility for her death.
Hitler was directly responsible for the conditions that she was in, for, if you like, driving her into a corner from which there appeared no escape, for making her a prisoner in a golden cage. And to that extent, contributed directly to her death.